Well, hello everyone. Thank you very much for listening and participating in this webinar today. I hope you find it useful and informative. The main thing I wanted to discuss with you today is utilisation rate. Now, what we're going to go through is what utilisation rate means and what it is, how much pasture you can take, what happens when you take a lot, what happens when you don't take much from both a pasture and a cattle performance point of view, and how to check how much you're taking. Now, Trisha D, can we please throw back to you for a poll?
Yes. Okay, launching the poll now. So, open for voting. Are you a cattle breeder, or do you trade cattle instead, or are you actually a service provider of some other description? Right, 100% have voted, so I'll close the poll and share the results. Okay, today we've got 31% of attendees are cattle breeders, 31% government employees. We've got probably one cattle trader and one NRM service provider, and a few others. I'll hide and hand over to you. Oh, Jode.
Wonderful, thank you, Trish. Thank you everyone for participating in the poll. So, according to Meat and Livestock Australia, the Grazing Land Management Materials, utilisation is the amount of annual pasture growth that is consumed. So I'm not talking about the amount of grass and forbs that were there last year as well as this year's new leaf. I'm only referring to this year's growth. Leave the stalks that have grown since the break of last season and just look at the ones that have grown this year. So that's the definition of utilisation rate. How much of the annual plant growth that is grazed between wet seasons. So what does this mean for me, I imagine you're asking? Well, as you're about to see, how much you graze, or rather how much you ensure is left behind at the end of the dry season, is the key to productivity and profitability. Most of our native pasture species in tropical northern Australia that are palatable, perennial and productive do not handle heavy grazing well. Examples of such native, palatable, perennial and productive pasture species, yes, that is a mouthful. Examples of such native, perennial, palatable, productive pasture species include Mitchell grass, the Astrabla species, curly bluegrass, which was the one before, and of course ribbon grass. Others include native millet and kangaroo grass as well, just to name a few local examples. And the reasons that these are all considered to make the #1 most valuable species list is that they all live for many years. For example, Mitchell grasses can live for up to 30 years per plant if treated well. And they all produce a lot of leaf in comparison to stem, so that makes them palatable, and cattle, or productive I should say, and cattle find them particularly tasty, making them palatable. So 3P grasses, when I say that, I mean palatable, productive and perennial native grass species. Such native grass pasture species, although resilient to climate pressures and fluctuations, are not as tolerant to grazing. Another poll please, Trish, if you're ready.
Yep, okay, so launching. Is your enterprise predominantly native pasture, improved pastures, unknown or not relevant? Okay, so 79% have voted and 93%, that might be all, so I'll close the poll. And so mostly we're dealing with native pasture species, Jode, with 54% responding with that. No one with improved pasture, one unknown, and a few not relevant.
Yeah, cool. Thanks, Trish. Thanks, everyone. That just gives me a bit of an idea of, yes, where it is that we're all coming from and how you might think about these types of pastures. So what happens, as we all know, when perennial pastures get rain? They use the energy reserves and nutrient reserves in the roots to send up new green shoots to capture energy from the sun, which allows more leaf production and allows the replenishment of the reserves in the roots used to create them. If the plant is heavily grazed at this time and has come to rely on its root reserves to replenish its sunlight capturing and energy creating leaves, then the root reserves of the plant suffer and decreases its ability to recover dramatically. And that is exactly what's occurred in the simulated trial conducted by the Graze project. These two plants are both black speargrass plants, Heteropogon contortus, and were established at the same time in a controlled environment. The plant on the left was cut back to mimic grazing once during the wet season, the growing season, and the plant on the right was cut back 2 or 3 times during the same period. As you can see, the plants on the right, on the right-hand side, would be a lot less able to contribute to soil stability, water infiltration, and nutrient cycling than the plant on the left. All of these roles and responsibilities are the actions that perennial plants contribute to the ecosystem. To ensure that these native pasture species are not grazed out in such a fashion, the Department of Primary Industry and Fisheries recommended utilisation rate is 20%. Remember, that's not 20% of the plant to be left behind, nor does it mean that 20% of the entire plant is usable. We are talking about just 20% of this year's growth is usable. Just this year's growth. And the number of cattle that can be run at this utilisation rate of the pasture is what we'd call the long-term carrying capacity. I can almost hear the inaudible astonishment coming from the webinar participants, Trish. Anyway, this is what 20% utilisation rate looks like. So really, although it is only 20%, when we're talking about plants and how much you can utilise, we're talking about the weight of the plant. So not necessarily the height of the plant, but we're talking about the weight of the plant. And what's happened here is that I went out into the paddock, and that had been burnt just last year before the wet season, and cattle haven't been back into it since. Our farm manager here is felling it, and I weighed each of these individual tussocks and hedged it with some shears until 20% of the weight was removed with each tussock. I had a little portable scales out in the paddock with me, and yeah, so I weighed the plant as a whole, cut it backwards and backwards and backwards until 20% of its weight had been removed and only 80% was left standing. In a real life scenario, this would be managed by yourselves controlling the number of animals allocated to any watering point. However, as you know, Mother Nature has a fair role to play in this game as well. If you get a really good wet season with evenly distributed rainfall, then the amount of growth you can expect from your perennials would be quite high. However, how many years in 10 do you get rainfall like that? I'll tell you right now, especially in the Katherine region, not many. In the Katherine region, the difference between the wettest year, which happened to be in 1984, and the driest year, which happened in 1952, was 1,136 millimetres. And that's the type of variable climate, and to a large extent pasture growth, that you are expecting to manage for. So that is what we would like you to consider. We would like you to consider using a moderate utilisation rate and therefore applying a conservative stocking rate to your pastures, so that in the event of below average or poorly distributed rain, your perennial tussocks will still have enough oomph to regenerate and produce enough leaf matter to provide your breeders with feed for the rest of the year and the year to come. So before I launch into some supportive arguments, also known as research, Trish, do we have any questions so far?
Yes, we do have one question, Jodie, from the audience, wanting to know how do I know what how do utilisation rates differ for different types of country? For example, spinifex versus Mitchell grass.
Oh, that's a very good question. And amazingly, yes, it does differ. So when we're talking about different land systems, or communities of pasture species or plant species that are different to others. It really depends on the soil, because of course the soil and the climate determine what plant species grow where. And on the soils that house, for example, your spinifex grasses, they are much more fragile, I'm going to use the word fragile, than those that occur on the cracking black soil plains. So to ensure the stability of the soil, because soil of course is one of our key indicators of good land condition, or of any land condition, we need to be more gentle in terms of our utilisation rate than of a soil type which is more stable, such as our cracking black soil clays. A utilisation rate which I think has been mentioned for spinifex pastures has been as low as 5 to 10% to ensure that the soil is stable and well taken care for.
Okay, thanks Jodie. And we've also just had another question come in from the audience. Would this also be the same situation with numbers of watering points and size of paddocks?
Well, I think if I'm interpreting the question correctly, I would say that to increase the carrying capacity of a paddock, you would of such a fragile paddock, you would have to put in more watering points. However, that isn't going to be able to change the utilisation rate of the pasture, purely because they are still on that fragile soil type. So while putting in more watering points would allow more numbers of animals to be held within that paddock, it wouldn't allow more numbers of cattle per water, if that makes sense. Yes, if that hasn't answered the question, please let me know.
Okay, thanks Jode. I haven't had any comments back, so hopefully, yes, that has, thanks. There you go.
Awesome. I feel successful already. This is good. Thank you very much, guys. So, I'll continue on. If the technology will let me, here we go. Okay, so to address some of these questions, the CSIRO, Department of Primary Industries and Fisheries, and Heytesbury Cattle Company set up the Sustainable Development of the Victoria River District Grazing Lands Trial. It's much easier to say the Pigeonhole Project, which is also commonly known as. In this project, they were aiming to answer a number of key questions, including what is the optimal level of grazing utilisation in terms of balancing livestock production and the maintenance of good land condition. And of course there are many others as well, but this question in particular has been of key interest to me, and I know it will be to you as well. Now before I go on, I just want to let you know that all of the graphs that I'm about to show you, which aren't too full on, but all of the graphs I'm about to show you have come straight from the final report, which you can find online. So if you simply Google Sustainable Development of Victoria River District Grazing Lands Final Report, you will find these graphs explained in more detail if you wish. So, there were many components to the Pigeonhole project, but the Mount Sanford component was conducted first, and it ran for 4 years, and they had 6 utilisation rates, and they varied from 13% down to 42%. And so that 42% utilisation rate of the pastures is, as you just heard, twice what our recommended safe carrying capacity is. So yes, let's go through some of the results that they found in this trial. So this is the average daily gain of the steers that were run in this trial, and as you can see, as the utilisation rate increased, the daily live weight gain, average daily live weight gain, decreased significantly. This would be because in the lighter utilisation rates, the cattle would be able to select a higher, better quality diet than down here, allowing such results. A similar trend was followed through into the breeders' weights. The breeders that were in the heavier utilisation rate paddocks were lighter than the ones in the lower utilisation rate paddocks. And as we all know, the state of a cow's body condition affects her ability to get back in calf. And in the heavier utilisation rates, such as the 42% and the 35% utilisation rates, the cows took longer and longer to get back in calf, which meant that they were having calves later and later, which meant that those breeders were eventually dropping out of the system. Also, they weren't in good enough condition to get quickly back in calf after giving birth at the right time of the year. This led to a decline in weaning rate through the treatments as utilisation rate increased. I think the cows were in the 13% utilisation paddocks had a weaning rate of around 68%, while those in the 42% utilisation rate paddocks had a weaning rate of approximately 57%. However, in the interest of full disclosure, I feel I must tell you this. When cattle productivity was assessed as kilograms per weaner sold per kilometre squared, heavier utilisation paddocks outcompeted the rest. Even though the weaners coming from these paddocks were lighter, on average, there was more of them, which allowed this result. This trend followed through to the economic analysis, which indicated that a producer or pastoralist such as yourselves would get a faster return on invested capital than any of the other pasture utilisation strategies. I'll just get people to have a look at that for a second, because there's a lot of information there to digest. So yes, as you can see, 11.3% return on capital at the 42% utilisation versus the 6.5% at 21% utilisation. However, we don't think that the results from the Mount Sanford trial section of the Pigeonhole project tell the whole story. This section of the Pigeonhole project only went for 4 years, and we don't think that was long enough to see the decline in land condition that we expected. Firstly, at the 23% utilisation rate, a number of targets were met, such as in the 23% and less utilisation rate paddocks, there was enough kilograms of grass and pasture left over in October to carry a fire. Now, this is important. As utilisation rate goes up and or it is increased, then the desirable species get grazed out. We know this. We know that cattle prefer the ice cream grasses over the boring cereal. We know this. So as the desirable palatable perennial species become less and less throughout the pasture, as their root systems become weaker and less able to regenerate year after year, then that's when there becomes an increase in the space between tussocks. And do you know what fills that space in between the tussocks? Annual grasses or weeds or trees. Now this is a problem because trees, believe it or not, it has been proven, has shown that trees will compete with native pastures for water and soil nutrients in some circumstances. Being able to have a fire every few years, every 4 years is the recommended rate, to control the canopy cover of your trees in a pasture is important. The annual utilisation rate of 23% allowed this. Next, we have the palatable yield in October being greater than 230 kilograms to maintain intact and keeps our breeders alive and in good nutrition. We're not talking about just any yield here, people. We're talking about palatable yield. We're talking about the yield of our 3P species, our Chrysopogon phalanxes, which is our ribbon grass, our Strabila species, which is our Mitchell grasses, our bluegrass species, all these important ones which make up our paddocks, which we depend upon. The 23% utilisation rate allowed that to happen. And last, but most importantly, was that the utilisation rate of 23% allowed at least 40% ground cover in October most years to reduce soil and water loss. People, if we don't have organic matter covering our soil and in our soil, there is no way that the rain actually infiltrates the soil profile. If that is not there, there is nothing to slow it down, to stop the beautiful rain taking all our topsoil away. These three components are essentially critical to maintain land condition. And while we're on the subject, guess which ones didn't do that? The high utilisation rates. The 39% and 42% utilisation rate treatments were not able to meet any of these targets. And guess what? They had the highest intercalving intervals. They also had the lightest weaner weights. They also had the lightest breeder weights. All of these are important to your pastoral enterprise. So, although the Mount Sanford trial was unable to capture long-term changes in land condition, there has been a trial run in Queensland that did capture it, and that was set up to answer many of the same questions as the Pigeonhole Project. And that trial was the Wombiana Project, which I'm sure you've all heard of, but to save you reading the final report like I have, I'm just going to go through some of the messages that they learnt there. The cattle key learnings were that the higher stocking rate was profitable in wet years. However, in dry years, it was unprofitable and reduced the future stocking rate capacity. Now let me go through this. Let me explain why higher stocking rate wasn't as profitable. Now, Wombiana is in central north Queensland, around the Charters Towers region, I believe, and they have greater access to markets than what we traditionally do in the Northern Territory. So when things weren't going quite well, they were able to offload easily, much easier than what we would up here in the north, or Northern Territory, I should say. Also, when things started to decline, they were able to have access to production feed those animals. So what actually happened in the high stocking rate paddocks was that everything was going along mighty fine and nicely in the wet years until the dry year, I should say, of 2002 to 2003. Now, this is when the drought hit in that region, and the effect that the high stocking rate paddock, or that the high stocking rate had on the pasture species in those paddocks, was noticed for years to come. For 4 years to come. Now that's significant. Who can afford to be feeding their animals for that long to ensure that, well, A, that they survive? This is a big deal, people. Because it became so unsustainable, they did actually have to reduce some of the numbers in the high stocking rate paddocks. So that's something to take into consideration as well. Also on the cattle side of things, the moderate stocking rate, which was run at the long-term carrying capacity, was as profitable as the rotation and the variable grazing strategies, and also required much less work. So something else to think about. Now, the land condition key learnings that they found. Well, this is what I'm most interested in, obviously, but I fully recognise it's all about the interactions. We need to have optimum production of both. So from a land condition front, the high stocking rate, which I neglected to mention, was run at twice the moderate stocking rate, which happened to be the same as the land condition, such as the long-term carrying capacity. So the high stocking rate is twice the long-term carrying capacity, caused degradation to the pastures, which started in B+ condition and declined over 13 years into C- condition. B+ to C-, people. And we'll go through further in just a little bit to explain what effect that would have had on the land. Actually, we've got some photos which I can show you, and what that would have meant to profitability in the long term, and also productivity. The moderate stocking rate paddocks maintained B+ condition despite the severe drought in 2002 and 2003. Those animals in the moderate stocking rate paddock, which were stocked at the long-term carrying capacity, also did not require any extra feeding when the drought hit. Something to think about. Although the variable stocking rate strategies were as profitable as the moderate stocking rate strategy, it was more riskier, and it had to be the pastures and cattle had to be monitored quite closely, and the managers had to be quite responsive when they noticed a decline. So that was quite appropriate for that region because they have access to markets that we don't, such as, or we now do, I suppose, such as an abattoir that was MSA grading at the time. So although it worked in that component of the business, it did result in a B- land condition after 13 years in comparison to the moderate stocking rate, which maintained pasture condition of B+. So I might have just bored you with words here, so I'm going to show you some photos. So this is what the trial paddock started out looking like back in 1998. As you can see on the left, that was the heavy stocking rate, which was twice the long-term carrying capacity, and on the right is the moderate stocking rate, which is run at long-term carrying capacity. So utilising that 20% of pasture growth per year. And as you can see, they were in a really good condition to start with. My apologies for the quality of the photos, but I do believe you can see what I'm talking about. Then the 2002-2003 wet season failed and produced drought circumstances. And this is what the paddocks look like. So on the left, again, you'll see the heavy stocking rate in very poor condition. In very poor condition. Look how much bare soil there is. And I don't know about you, but I cannot see a perennial tussock in there. Not one. Whereas on the right, where we've got our moderate stocking rate, there's bare soil there. There's more than what there was in the years before, back in 1998. However, I can still see some 3P tussocks in there. In fact, there's quite a few of them. So that was the difference between the moderate stocking rate and the heavy stocking rate. Gone backwards. Right, so if we were to try and utilise the messages that we learned from the Wombiana trial in Queensland and apply them to our Mount Sanford trial in the Pigeonhole project, this is what we would have expected to see. So we would have seen the land in A condition, which had great 3P tussock density. Cannot see any bare soil to save myself. There are no weeds, and the trees there are not dense enough to be competing with our pastures. This is the land system that the trial was actually conducted on, the Wave Hill land system. Then we would have noticed, had in our heavy stocking rate, our heavy utilisation rate paddocks, we would have seen more distance in between our palatable, perennial, productive tussocks. We would have noticed an increase in increases species. Now, I'm not sure how familiar you guys are with your increases species identification, and I hate telling people how to stack eggs, but I just want to draw your attention to the fact that of the Aristida, the feathertop wiregrass, which can be seen all through here. So this is what's allowed the landscape to be classified as B condition, because these increases species have moved in and are competing with our palatable perennial productive species. So although Aristida is a perennial species, once it gets its seed heads on it, it's no longer palatable to cattle. They may graze a few of the curly, nice soft leaves around the base, but will largely leave the plant intact. So this is actually B condition. Excuse me while I... Now, having land in B condition will actually result in a 25% decline in long-term carrying capacity. And let me tell you why that is. The reason is because your 3P species, your palatable productive perennial species, which hold the soil together, which can be relied upon year after year to be there, whether it rains or whether it doesn't, they will still be there, unless there aren't as many of them. Either that or they aren't as healthy. Therefore, land in B condition can only hold 85% of cattle in comparison to what land would have been in A condition. As you can see, to get to C condition, the land has had quite a, excuse the expression, but flogging. There has been a significant reduction in 3P tussocks, your palatable productive perennial tussocks, and there's now a weed presence, rubber bush. You'll also note a high proportion of bare soil. Now, as we discussed just earlier, having organic matter on the soil is essential to enabling rainfall to penetrate the soil profile and allowing it to become useful for plant growth. If we allow that rain to just run off because there is no organic matter there holding the water there, then it's not useful. Grass cannot make use of that. Land in C condition results in 55% loss of long-term carrying capacity, purely because the 3P species purely aren't there anymore. Or they are there in this case, but are few and far between. We have no guarantee, or we have minimal guarantee, that should there be a wet season, there won't be much growth from those plants to allow the breeders in that paddock to survive, if that makes sense. I'm sorry, I get a bit passionate about these things, and sometimes I'm just not sure I've explained something correctly, so please raise your hand if I have not explained something well enough. Now, we would have expected, should we have continued the Mount Sandford trial part of the Pigeonhole project for long enough, we would have seen a drop in land condition to D condition in those heavy utilisation rate paddocks. Now, this would have been where there was bare soil, which, as we just talked about, cannot capture rainfall for moisture in the soil profile. There are no perennial grasses here, and it is just full of useless species. Land in this state results in an 80% loss of long-term carrying capacity. Now, I just wanted to speak to you here. This is a model that we use to explain land condition and how it can get to such a state quickly or not. From A to B condition, you can see, which is like we just spoke about, so a decrease in perennial species, is quite a gentle slope, which means that it is quite easy to rejuvenate that country, and such a strategy might be a wet season spell. So removing the cattle prior to the wet season and making sure that they are not reintroduced before the plants have had a chance to set seed. That may be all that's required to reinvigorate a pasture from B condition, or an area from B land condition to A land condition. If a area becomes into C condition from B condition, it's a steeper slope. It can happen quicker than A to B and more easily. Now, to fix this, you'll have to have significant contribution, and that may mean whether a paddock is completely destocked for a number of wet seasons to ensure that those 3P pasture species have the chance to set seed. Now, keeping in mind that mitchell grass, for example, the Astrabula species, have a successful seeding event once every 10 years. It's something to think about. Or it may require significant weed intervention, significant weed intervention strategies, my apologies, or erosion control. And then we hit the bottom clanger, D condition. This is a very steep slope and can happen quite rapidly. Now, I have heard figures of up to 30 years to get land from D condition back into a usable A or B condition. Who has 30 years to turn productivity around, I ask? I would much prefer to help producers prevent that from happening, and if we can in the DPIF, we surely would love to. So we're coming towards the end now, and I just want to give you a couple of strategies to check to see how much you're taking. If you have any exclosures on your property, such as ones that were set up for the Swiftsend trials back in the day, or perhaps turkeys' nests are good exclosures as well. If you have lanes in your on your station that were used last year but haven't been utilised yet, or you have ungrazed areas that were burnt previously, as in like the end of last year, you can use the size of those plants as an indicator in comparison to the plants out in the paddock as an indication of how much has been utilised. That's one way. The other thing you could do would be to conduct a task such as I did, where you pull the individual species out, your key pasture species out, weigh them individually, cut off 20%, and then use that as an indicator throughout your paddocks as to whether you have grazed more or less than 20%. Or, alternatively, you could ask a DPIF member for a carrying capacity assessment. You could even attend a grazing land management course, which we are going to run in the next little while, or you could install some grazing exclosures, like you can see in the background there. Should you wish for some further reading on the subject, please feel free to download any of these products. They are available if you Google them, either that or they are on the Future Beef website. Another publication that we have available is the Land Condition Guides. Now, we've got one for the Victoria River District labelled here, but we've also got one for the Sturt Plateau and the Mitchell grasses on the Barkly Tablelands as well, something that you may find useful. And just to recap, I would like to, oh goodness me, I've missed a point, my apologies, sorry Trish, if you can bear with me. Something that I meant to mention, in the Mount Sanford trial, when pasture was trending this way, so it was going from this B condition and was heading towards C condition, they were conducting fecal analysis as well, the dietary analysis of the cattle in those paddocks. And even though they were, even though the cattle in the highest utilisation rate, the 42% utilisation rate paddocks, were receiving the same amount of nutrition as those in the 13, or the same quality of nutrition as those in the 13 utilisation rate paddocks. So that to me would indicate that they were grazing, preferentially grazing, as we all know that cattle do. But that would also indicate that if people were using cattle as an indication of management strategies or the successfulness of their management strategies, they wouldn't be getting an accurate answer. There is a lag time between drop in cattle condition and the drop in land condition. Just something to keep in mind. So yes, back to our key messages. Cow condition is not an indicator of good land management. Short-term gain can be obtained by using heavy stocking, and which in hand means heavy pasture utilisation. However, you will quickly come undone when land condition declines to such a bad state in dry years that your long-term carrying capacity is reduced because your tussocks just aren't as resilient. Also, by using a moderate stocking rate, such as something closer to the long-term carrying capacity, so that means using 20% utilisation rate of 3P species, is best for maintaining or improving land condition, which we all know is much cheaper than buying more country. And that's all you have to hear from me. Back to you, Trish.
Thank you very much, Jodie. Over to the audience. Are there any questions out there? I do have one from Ken Shaw, but if anyone else has a question, please raise your hand or send one through the question box. Ken, I might actually unmute you. I just need to find you. And if you don't mind, if you could ask the question. You're unmuted now. Can we hear you? No, I can't hear you, Ken. So I might just, he did send me a question, Jodie, and from what I can understand, he's got annuals are important in red soil, especially during the wet. What is the recommended utilisation?
Sure. Ken, I could not agree with you more. One of the key components of the red soil land systems are the fact that the red soil land systems aren't selfish. So unlike the clay land system, like the clay units, I suppose, in the black soils, which are selfish and hold on to moisture, the red soils generally are not, and will give up most of the moisture to their plant species, which on red soil is quite often annual, so it's quite often annually dominated species, such as your limestone grasses and your woollybutt grasses. So yes, Ken, I absolutely could not agree with you more. As for a utilisation rate, to mine springs 5 to 10%, but I could not be sure of that. Ken, if I could, if you'd be willing to, I would absolutely love to speak to you afterwards, and I will find the answer more accurately if I can.
Okay, thank you very much for that answer. Jodie, I have another question here. Why is it that I can graze holding paddocks very heavily during the dry season and yet they look fantastic every year?
That is a very good question, Trish. That would be because the holding paddocks typically aren't used during the wet season, and it's the wet season which is the key time that our pasture species need to be spelled in order to get an improvement in land conditions. So even though that they are heavily grazed year after year, they are getting that annual wet season spell. So that our 3P species, which are our palatable perennial productive species, such as our Mitchell grasses and our ribbon grass and curly bluegrass, are being given that chance every year, 100% of them in that within your holding paddocks to reseed again, and they aren't being grazed. So that's why. It's just that they're getting the opportunity that other paddocks aren't getting.
Okay, thank you very much, Jodes. Well, we don't have any more questions from the audience, and I think you're finished now, aren't you, Jodie?
Yes, that's me. That's done. I'm talked out.
Okay, well, thank you very much for your time today. And that's to Jodie, but also to the audience. I hope that this has been helpful and that the technology worked well for you. Oh, wait a second. We've got a well done, Jodie, come in. I thought it was a question. After the webinar, a survey will pop up asking a few questions about how the webinar went for you. We would really appreciate if you provide a little bit of time to give us some feedback, as this is the first webinar of this kind that Jodie has presented. And Jodie, thank you very much for your time today. We've had another person pop in saying, great information, well presented. Thank you. So enjoy the rest of your afternoon, people, and goodbye for now.